unprecedented civic mobilization, which was extraordinary enough. But the institutions of power were not reformed, in particular the abusive powers of the procuracy and systemic corruption. So throughout the Orange years, on the Yushchenko, that was largely left untouched. Worse, the division of powers between the president and prime minister turned into a paralyzing tug of war that discredited the Orange leaders so much that Viktor Yanukovych, the fraudster of 2004, was able to win a fair and free, but still very close election in 2010. Now, what we have been witnessing in the past 10 days, since January 19, is a rebellion, not merely against the current government, but against the Yanukovych regime, namely the way that officials have been practicing politics since the 2010 election. Actually, one could even see it as a rebellion against the very nature of post-Soviet Ukrainian politics, including practices that remained in force under Yushchenko. The galvanizing element has been the repeated instances of state violence, whether by regular internal ministry police, Berkut special forces, Natalia talked about, or mercenaries known as titushki, or known in common parlance sometimes as, well, thugs. The Maidan insurrection is a reaction, totally unexpected, but part of a recurring pattern globally. So there's something actually comparable. A reaction against the contempt expressed by officials in or near power towards the individual. The degrading cases of taunting, public humiliation, and beatings by Berkut forces in particular that are circulating in social media, pretty disturbing images, videos, not to mention the abductions and torture of activists, have struck a very powerful chord because despite their extreme nature, they are seen to epitomize the impunity that authorities display towards the powerless, civilians. The popular rebellion last summer in Mykolaiv, in southern Ukraine, not in western Ukraine, but in southern Ukraine, against police involvement in and cover-up of a rape case, can be seen as a harbinger of the Maidan phenomenon that has not only gotten closer spatially to the epicenter of power, as we saw. The barricades are getting very, very close to. Natalia pointed to the Verkhovna Rada, but there's also the Bankova, the Drža Administracja, the presidential offices are very, it's more than walking distance. It's a block away. So they've not only gotten closer spatially to the epicenter of power with the barricades on Hrushevskovo, but has spread in various degrees of intensity throughout Ukraine. So we see in all the oblasts of western Ukraine, the regional administration offices have been captured, and then there's protests or attempts, similar attempts in central Ukraine, even in eastern Ukraine. They've been repelled, but there's been a lot of that happening, all in the last 10 days. The case that I alluded to in Mykolaiv was taking place in a small town or village, and basically you have that kind of popular insurrection when they stormed the police station, and that's in party of region fiefdom. To be sure, Maidan began, as Natalia said, on November 21st as a protest against the decision by Yanukovych to turn his back to Europe, or more specifically to the free trade agreement that was to be signed at the Vilnius summit, which is why the protests were called EuroMaidan, and even the main media that was reporting all that, Ukraińska Prawda, on the internet, called itself for a while Europejska Prawda. Yet the excessive force displayed by the police on the night of November 30th and the large-scale attempt on the night of December 11th to clear the square with the threat of force looming, although really used, changed the nature of the protests. The severe beating of journalist activist Tatiana Chornovol, the multiple cases of abductions, such as the leader of EuroMaidan, the repeated attacks on journalists, and on the whole undisciplined behavior of Berkut forces have reinforced the shift towards a rebellion against an authority perceived to be illegitimate and unaccountable, at least by the activists on the square. And yet, it is striking that the first instances of violence perpetrated by Maidan activists, the firebombs, the rock throwing, and assaults on buildings, all beginning 10 days ago to this day, was a direct reaction to the laws rushed through Parliament on January 16. So the reaction was not immediate to the state violence, but to actually what happened in Parliament. These laws that essentially criminalize political opposition, at least on paper. Most of them have been repealed yesterday morning, but I'm still unclear about the ones that are kind of still on the books, so we're a little bit foggy there. It is precisely when political avenues were blocked and that everyone on the square was at the risk of arrest, because demonstrations were banned altogether, that the recourse to violence by activists, which in itself is unprecedented in political demonstrations in independent Ukraine, occurred. The political effect was immediate. President Yanukovych, for the first time in nearly 2 months, was willing to negotiate, although initially through an intermediary who happens to be the same official who orchestrated the fraud in 2004, by the way, Mr. Kluev. Same cast of characters. After the first deaths were reported on January 22nd, like a week ago, a very grim day, Yanukovych began face-to-face negotiations. The oppositions didn't want to negotiate with a third party, which led to his offer that was rejected last Saturday to appoint Mr. Yatsenyuk as Prime Minister, and led also to the repeal yesterday of most of these repressive laws and the current negotiations, among others, over a law on amnesty that will be largely aimed at activists currently in prison. Now, in terms of strict political efficacy, then, the decision to unleash violence paid off, since at least in the short term it broke the political impasse. Violence, however, is a dangerous tool to wield. It also raises fundamental normative questions. When violence broke out on Hrushevskoho on January 19, we have to remember that the early narrative in the pro-Maidan social media, Facebook and all that, was that so-called provocateurs or pro-regime infiltrators were behind it. It is only after a largely unknown group, Natalia just talked about, Pravi Sector, claimed ownership of the initiative that the narrative changed to one accepting the necessity of violence, the necessity of throwing cocktail molotovs at the police as an act of legitimate resistance against an oppressive regime. We have since learned that several groups are in fact integral to this transformation of the Maidan that Natalia observed from up close for so long, from a peaceful to an offensive force. Offensive not in the normative sense, but in the sense of being on the attack sometimes. Remarkably, the groups that she mentioned briefly at the end of her presentations cut across the entire political spectrum. Pravi Sector would appear to be at the far right, with elements claiming a Ukraine for Ukrainians, while anarchists in a group named Spilna Sprava, Common Cause, are on the left. So the anarchists, kind of the equivalent of the black blocs that we see in Canadian demonstrations or Quebec demonstrations. Spilna Sprava would appear to be, again, more like a leftist or far leftist group. And then we have the football radicals, the ultras, more inclined to act as hooligans in the British sports tradition in normal times, but who are now committed throughout Ukraine, even in the east, to, as some of them say, protect the honor of Ukraine, Translation: they're fed up with seeing policemen beating up regular folks. This concatenation of forces, of desperate groups, is astonishing, but also extremely volatile. Their tactical alliance is certainly the demonstration that the protests have not been hijacked, as has been claimed, by the far right, if that is meant by hardline nationalists. The protests may have been hijacked by hardline activists, but the football ultras, for instance, would not spare 1 minute to honor the memory of Bandera. That's not what they're doing, why they're doing it. The great absent in this story is actually the far better known group who cares very much about Bandera, namely Svoboda. Despite the recent tradition of roughing up folks at public events and being in cahoots with disreputable far-right types in Western Europe, such as Le Front National in France, Svoboda has acted as a fairly disciplined and responsible political organization that has not issued political channels. While the parting of the ways is inevitable sometimes in the future between at least the Klitschko and the Tirhnebok constituency, Tirhnebok being the leader of Svoboda, the three political opposition leaders have acted in a united front in negotiations with Yanukovych and in the Rada. And all three have experienced great difficulties in keeping the trust of the Maidan constituency, or in the case of Tirhnebok, of the non-Svoboda constituency. They're all boomed. Not always, but often. There's always this distrust of political parties. Svoboda has acted mostly as a security force in and around the square, and has even resorted to force, that's the latest we've heard, with rubber bullets and all, to dislodge the contingent of Spilna Sprava that had occupied the Ministry of Agriculture just last night, since the occupation of the ministry made no strategic sense for the cause of the Maidan. They didn't want to leave, so Svoboda basically beat the hell out of them to make them leave. The one set of activists, that one set of activists is now attacking another is disturbing, but that it was done for the sake of the political logic of the protest movement reinforces the curiously stabilizing role that Svoboda troops have been playing, so far at least. Now, how legitimate is the Maidan rebellion? And by that I mean how legitimate not from our point of view, but we can discuss that, but from that of Ukrainians themselves, the citizens of Ukraine. There is no question that the narrative of Western conspiracy prevalent in 2004 is still very much alive. This is the mindset of President Putin in Russia, most likely of Yanukovych himself, certainly of the two most vocal Party of Region deputies, Mr. Kolesnichenko and Tsarov. And the Berkut website, as we learned, even links the conspiracy to Jews. So the most blatant anti-Semitism actually comes from the special forces. So where's Svoboda when we need it, right? The claim is the claim of conspiracy, of Western's conspiracy, like behind the movement, is ludicrous, since opposition leaders, starting with the one leading the polls, Klitschko, cannot even control Maidan activists. It's hard to believe they can't control it, like someone like far away in Washington or in Brussels can actually control them. Yet believers in conspiracies challenge the veracity of verifiable facts. That is why, this is why, incidentally, pro-Maidan claims based on Russian conspiracy, such as the presence of Russian troops, should be dismissed on the same grounds. There is no evidence whatsoever of a Russian force presence in Ukraine. If Mr. Putin decides to use such a strategy, it would provoke a rebellion within the Party of Regions, and would likely be limited to Crimea, which would be destabilizing enough. A far more reasonable questioning of the legitimacy of the Maidan protest has to do with the degree to which they are democratic and the degree to which they represent the whole country. In the first instance, the argument is that the protests are seeking to replace what should be done in a regular political game, political process, such as the conduct of presidential election in 2015. The point is not merely made for partisan purposes, beginning with Yanukovych and others, but by political scientists, such as Keith Darden, who wrote it at a time when violence was not in the picture, back in December. In other words, that a minority of activists push aside a majority of voters is seen as problematic. Now, the problem here is that the Yanukovych government since 2010 has steadily proceeded to subvert the conditions under which an open contestation can take place in Ukraine by neutralizing the courts, resorting anew to blackmail to create a parliamentary majority that does not reflect actually the popular vote. Last year, the three opposition parties combined, so the Tymoshenko party, currently headed by Yatsenyuk, the new party by Klitschko, Udar, and Svoboda. So the three opposition parties combined did better than the Party of Regions and the Communists taken together. And yet, they're in a minority in parliament. And also by using selective and politicized justice to eliminate opponents, Tymoshenko being, obviously, the preeminent case. Now, prior to EuroMaidan, it appeared most probable to me, at least to me, that the Yanukovych regime was intent on stealing the 2015 election. Now, the January 16 laws removed any uncertainty whatsoever in that matter, that there wouldn't be an election, an open election. Klitschko said it well yesterday. We're not here to change the government, but to change the rules of the game, meaning creating, or rather recreating, the conditions for an open contest, which entails curbing the abusive presidential powers towards the court, parliament, the electoral commissions, and the procuracy. All of this appeared unimaginable just a month ago, but the pressure of the streets could break the political system open or lead to a much worse outcome. Regional polarization in Ukraine is a topic that I have studied for 20 years. At a basic sociological level, the regional cleavage is strong. The Russian-speaking southeast votes Yanukovych en bloc. The Ukrainian-speaking center-west votes Orange/Maidan parties en bloc. That's kind of a given in Ukrainian electoral politics. On the EU question, the polls still showed very significant regional variations. Maidan is disproportionately Kievan, from Kiev, well, maybe understood, it's taking place in Kiev, but also disproportionately central in Western Ukrainians, with few Easterners, certainly among the 24/7 activists. And within that group, Western Ukrainians are clearly overrepresented among the 24/7 activists, those who live there, perhaps up to twice their demographic weight in the country. And yet, there are signs that the regional cleavage is eroding. A December poll by a reputable agency, the Kiev International Institute for Sociology, Mohyla University, showed that while the East was much more pro-Russia than pro-EU, the young people, the cohort 18 to 30 years old, were actually pro-Europe in the East. This was new compared to 2004. And now we have the report that the football ultras are joining forces with Maidan activists in several eastern cities in attempting to seize government buildings. They're generally part of that demographics, 18 to 30. Contrary to Kiev, or Western Ukraine, the Maidan rebels in the east don't have the numbers on their side, and the regime is relying on other apolitical athletic types, the Titushkis, to crush them. Maybe crush is a bit strong because it's kind of a give back and forth. The fact is we have but the very fact that we have that kind of mobilization in the East is unprecedented, never happened before. A complementary point pertains to the intensity of orientations, the readiness to act upon one's belief. As shown twice in the last decade, Ukrainians from Kiev and Western Ukraine are far more able to mobilize than Ukrainians from the East. Either way, for whatever cause. Ukrainians in the East being steeped in a more passive culture. Moreover, in an important commentary in the absolute overload of information that we get from all sources, one particular commentary posted in late December by the Canadian-born Kiev analyst Mikhailo Vinnytsky noted that Kiev and Lviv are now acting as magnet cities with demographic growth and the development of cutting-edge post-industrial sectors such as information technology. While the cities of the East, Donetsk and Kharkiv, for instance, are declining demographically, struggling to overcome their obsolete industrial base. Political grievances emanating from the West, and by that I mean Kiev, central and western Ukraine, have to be seen in the context of the economic and demographic epicenter shifting, to some extent, from the East to the West. Now, where does that leave us? It is futile to attempt to make predictions, but different scenarios can be envisaged, at least as of January 29, we are today. First scenario is that the regime cracks, loses the will to use force, the rules of the game are changed, and anticipated presidential elections are held. Or perhaps the presidential powers are so diminished that the real game becomes the formation of a coalition government. That is, we shift from a presidential to a parliamentary system. That could include a coalition government, that could include a dissident faction of the Party of Regions. That's one scenario, and then there's all kinds of variation of it. Some kind of really political breakthrough would be one scenario. A second scenario is that a crackdown, or an attempted crackdown, very bloody, not only isolates Ukraine internationally, but begets a violent insurgency, at least in western Ukraine. So if we ever get to see something terrible in the center of Kiev, with a lot of bloodshed, that wouldn't be the end of it. Then the battle would go underground. Who knows? The third scenario is that a prolonged stalemate creates the type of violence against police officers or civilians that would discredit the protest. That is the violence that we've seen, which, at least in the area of the Maidan, the expanded area of the Maidan, is a violence directed at property or at people bearing arms, namely police officers, or anti-riot. There hasn't been violence against civilians or excessive force used against police. But once again, violence is in the air. Who knows what could happen? So that's a grim scenario. A fourth scenario is that central power begins to weaken, leading to the de facto so-called autonomy of certain areas. The center starts to lose its grips on certain regions, with all eyes fixated on Crimea and Donetsk. Fears of quote-unquote civil war are regularly stoked in public discourse, this morning by former President Kravchuk. But when we have young men, politically driven or apolitical, getting used to violence and police forces acting with impunity, we have the ingredients for a brew that could turn toxic. But since political channels have produced important breakthroughs in the past few days, including the long-standing Maidan demand for the resignation of the government, not just the Prime Minister, well, the Prime Minister and then the government, it's automatic, then there is reason to be optimistic. And on that note, let's take questions. Thank you.